Good evening. Welcome to the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University Institute of Politics. Tonight's events are sponsored by the Council of Women World Leaders. I'm Laura Listwood, the Secretary General of the Council of Women World Leaders, the Center for Public Leadership, the Kennedy School of Government, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and the Project on Justice in Times of Transition. We're very, very pleased tonight to have with us two world leaders sitting here at the podium. The first one will introduce the second one. The Right Honorable Kim Campbell is the former Prime Minister of Canada. She is the first woman Prime Minister of Canada. She is one of two women who has ever attended and participated in a G7 event. You can perhaps guess who the other one was. Lady Thatcher. Kim Campbell is a lawyer. She became the first woman to be named Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada. She has also attained the portfolios of the Minister of Defense, National Defense, the first woman to obtain that position, the Minister of Veterans Affairs. She became the first female Prime Minister on June 25th, 1993. By September or October of 1993, she achieved the highest approval rating for a Prime Minister in 30 years. However, Ms. Campbell and her party were defeated in the general election. As she is wont to say, and I repeat, democracy is a blunt instrument. However, it's been to the benefit of Harvard and the Kennedy School that Ms. Campbell is with us. She has been a fellow at the Kennedy School 3 times now, at the Institute of Politics, at the Shorenstein Center, and currently at the Center for Public Leadership. We're very pleased that she's able to be here with us until the end of this school year. After her prime ministership, she became the Consul General for Canada, located in Los Angeles. Today, she currently is the chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, and we're very pleased to have her with us. Kim?
Thank you very much. Thank you and good evening. In my first incarnation, I was a political scientist. And when I was an undergraduate studying political science many years ago, there were a number of intractable problems in the world that made great grist for students to study, but the solutions of which seemed to elude even the most vivid imagination. One of those, of course, was the reign of communism in the former Soviet Union, and the other was the situation in South Africa and the apartheid regime. What is extraordinary, and one of the advantages of getting older, is you actually see history unfold and problems get resolved in ways that you could never have imagined and hoped. I don't think there's anyone who does not share an enormous sense of hope and enthusiasm and goodwill for the future of South Africa, and who is not astounded that the situation there, that the apartheid regime ended without the convulsion of that country. And that wasn't an accident. It was a result of leadership. And this evening, we have the great honor here to hear from one of the extraordinary players, an extraordinary leader, whose vision and willingness to re-examine the reality that he had grown up in was so important in creating that change. Frederick Willem deKlerk has degrees in arts and law. He practiced law for 11 years before being elected to the South African Parliament in 1972. By 1978, he was a minister in the government of South Africa and served in a variety of portfolios until 1989. He became leader of the National Party in the Transvaal, and not long after that, after his predecessor, P.W. Botha, had a stroke, he was unanimously elected president of South Africa. Now, some of you may not know that television actually came to South Africa later than it came to countries like Canada and the United States. And Mr. deKlerk was known as the first television president of South Africa, and he used media very effectively in achieving the goals that were so important to him over the next few years. In 1990, he made a famous speech in which there were some very important announcements that would fundamentally change South Africa and accelerate the elimination of apartheid. He announced that Nelson Mandela would be released from prison. He announced that many organizations would be unbanned, including the African National Congress and the South African Communist Party. And he also introduced other initiatives that led directly to South Africa's first ever universal franchise election in April of 1994. After the election in 1994, F.W. de Klerk was sworn into office as one of 2 executive deputy presidents in South Africa's new national unity government. He resigned from government in 1996. In 1993, 1997. In 1993, he shared the Nobel Peace Prize with another great leader, Nelson Mandela. In 1999, he established the F.W. de Klerk Foundation to continue the success and stability of the new multicultural South African democracy. Some of you had the opportunity to hear President de Klerk in David Gergen's class this afternoon. For those of you who did not, I can tell you, you are in for a treat. This is an extraordinary man and an extraordinary leader and one of the architects of the history of our time. I'm delighted to introduce President F.W. de Klerk.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for the wonderful introduction, for the warm words extended to me, for the warm reception that my wife and I has had here. It's really a great pleasure to be able to address this famous forum at this world-renowned university. This institution of excellence taking such a top place amongst all the institutions of excellence across the world. It is also a great honor to be invited to address the ARCO Forum by the Council of Women World Leaders, who have done me the honor of asking me to serve as one of their advisors on their board. Now, having reached the age which I've reached, I have learned that when prominent ladies call on you to do something, you say yes. And here I am. May I say on the issue of the position of women in public life, I think that we have reached a stage worldwide where much greater recognition is being given, long overdue recognition, to the role that women should play in public life. We in South Africa, I'm happy to report, has become a world leader in this regard in the area of the development of women leadership. Our parliament and government have a higher percentage of women members than those of almost any other country, and you can check my facts, it's true. It has also been my honor to have become the first Prime Minister or President in the history of South Africa to appoint a woman to the cabinet. In the early 90s, we had the first woman cabinet member ever, Dr. Rina Venter. Today, I think there are about 7 women serving in the South African cabinet. Ladies and gentlemen, I've chosen as a theme for my speech, and maybe it will be against the background of the introduction somewhat of a disappointment to you. Not in the main speech, you're welcome to deal with that in questions, about particularly what happened in South Africa. We've just done so in David Gergen's class. But rather to choose something which I think lies at the root of conflict around the world. It might be controversial what I'm going to say. The theme of my speech is the need for democracies to extend freedoms, rights, and protection not only to individuals, but to classes of peoples and communities as well. I believe that freedom requires more than the affirmation of individual rights. We humans are complex social beings with many concentric relationships. We are individuals. We belong to families. We pursue our economic interests. We belong to clubs and organizations. Many of us have religious affiliations. We often belong to distinct cultural groups. We have gender and sexual orientation. We are citizens of countries, and increasingly we belong also to the international community. All of these relationships are important to us, and some are critically important. In many, if not most of them, we are minorities. True freedom consists of our being able to make lawful choices for ourselves and our families in all these spheres. The limits of these freedoms should be restricted, I believe, only by manifest public interest and the point where our freedoms begin to impact negatively and unfairly on the freedoms and interests of others. For example, I'm an individual. I belong to the deKlerk family. I belong to the Reformed Church. I'm a member of a number of private organizations, including a number of golf clubs. I'm an Afrikaner. I derive my language, my history and my traditions and much of my identity from this fact. I'm also a very proud citizen of the new, vibrant and multicultural South Africa. Like my ancestors since 1688, I'm also an African. I'm not a European. And I like to think that I'm also a citizen of the world. After all, I have a Greek mother-in-law. None of these relationships, ladies and gentlemen, is mutually exclusive. People can be all these things at the same time, and we all are different things at the same time. And the reasonable rights in each and all of these spheres of all people need to be protected. Neither should they suffer discrimination because of these affiliations. I shouldn't be forced to choose between being an Afrikaner and a South African. Buthelezi, the leader of the Zulu, shouldn't be forced to choose between being a Zulu and a South African. Both of us are both. And President Mandela shouldn't be forced to choose between being a member of the royal family of one of the royal houses of the Xhosa nation and being a South African. He's both. And somehow or another, this multifaceted aspect of our lives should be accommodated in the rules and the regulations and the constitutions and the systems. Because the moment you try to force somebody to negate a part of his or her reality, that moment you sow the seeds for discontent. The Basques are Basques, and there are Spaniards, and there are Europeans. The Scottish are Scots, but they're also citizens of Great Britain, and the Europeans. And somehow or another, in constitutional arrangements and dealing with political rights and dealing with your place in society, you must accommodate all these realities. The other side of this coin is that no one's freedom should infringe upon other freedoms, and therefore one's freedom should be in balance with one's responsibility. In all of their relationships, people must accept that they also have duties, not only rights. They must respect the affiliations of others and the reasonable claims of the broader society. Once again, for example, I'm also a member of an increasingly suppressed minority. I'm a smoker. I believe that I have a right to smoke, but I have come to accept that this right is limited where it impacts negatively on others. However, ladies and gentlemen, if our rights in any of our relationships are unreasonably restricted, we are not truly free. If we suffer unfair discrimination because of our race, our gender, our culture, our language, our religion, or our social class, or any of our valued affiliations, we feel aggrieved. And such grievances frequently lead to alienation, to friction and conflict. Free societies, accordingly, have a duty to extend rights and protection to their citizens, not only as individuals, but in all of their relationships. I do not subscribe to the theory that the recognition and protection of individual rights on its own is sufficient to prevent miscarriage of justice or denial of freedoms. If it were the case, you would not have had a black caucus in America. Great Britain would not have created regional parliaments for the Scots and the Welsh. And the new South African Constitution would not have recognized the rights of 11 linguistic entities. And the Council of Women Leaders would not have existed. The reality is that there is a need also next to individual human rights to recognize what I would like to call collective rights. In my view, the societies that are the most creative and the most successful are those that protect and understand and, where necessary, encourage plural. My Afrikaans tongue has a difficulty to say pluralism. I believe that they are those that assure the freedom of their citizens in all their affiliations, and that promote the diffusion of influence and autonomy throughout civil society. And just as freedom entails more than the protection of individual rights, true democracy is also much more than merely the rule of the majority. Your own founding fathers in America were acutely aware that majorities could also be tyrannical. James Madison warned that, I quote, "If the majority will be united by a common interest, then the rights of the minority will be insecure." Perhaps the greatest safeguard for minorities is the prospect of one day becoming the majority. This helps to ensure that the majority of the day will respect the rights of the minority in the hope that their own rights will be similarly respected should they ever become the minority. But what happens when a ruling party is assured of a permanent majority because it represents majority communities in ethnically or culturally divided societies? In such cases, a country can easily have all the trappings of democracy with none of its essence. What happens in such cases to those who find themselves in permanent minority positions? How can they be assured that majorities will not ride roughshod over their interests? There is little prospect of such a development in the first world, since majorities in Western democracies are formed according to sensible criteria such as shared values and political affiliation. But the prospect of permanent exclusion from meaningful power is a stark reality for many ethnic, cultural, and religious minorities in many countries all over the world. And this phenomenon lies at the root of most of the conflict in the world today. If we were to ask, what is the root cause? Why is there so many serious conflicts across the world? Analysis will show that in most cases, it is the failure to manage diversity. It is the failure, whether it's religious diversity, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity, racial diversity. Somehow or another, if we want to promote world peace, we have to find the answers how to accommodate the stresses and strains which quite naturally results from the very existence of diversity. As we enter the new millennium, I believe that we are confronted with a new threat to peace, the specter of intercommunal conflict. Throughout most of our history, the main source of conflict was the rivalry between nations, alliances, and ideologies. It was such rivalries that spawned the First and Second World Wars and that posed the major threat to global peace during the Cold War. However, since the collapse of global communism, the threat of international and inter-alliance warfare has receded. Another form of conflict has come to the fore that has its roots in the inability of different ethnic, cultural, and religious communities to coexist within the same political units or the same geographic entities. The present and recent violence in the former Yugoslavia, Chechnya, Rwanda, Burundi, Sudan, Sri Lanka, Kashmir, and Indonesia are all examples of this kind of conflict. In some cases, as those in Kashmir and Central Africa, such conflicts also hold the potential of sparking off wars between neighboring nation states. These conflicts seldom have any direct impact on you in the United States. But as we have seen from the violence in Spain and Northern Ireland, not even the most enlightened Western democracies are immune from the havoc that they can cause. Throughout the world, intercommunal conflicts are characterized by implacable hatred and extraordinary brutality, frequently involving ethnic cleansing and communal massacres. Unfortunately, we become desensitized to the litany of suffering that they bring, to the pathetic strings of refugees, to reports of atrocities, to the images of conflict that flash across our TV screens on the nightly news. Very often we are hardly aware of many of these conflicts, like the seemingly interminable war in the southern Sudan, where TV news teams seldom penetrate. And yet, cumulatively, they represent a rolling holocaust, causing enormous suffering to millions of people throughout the world. One of the great challenges of the new millennium will be to diffuse such conflicts and to devise norms and approaches that will enable different communities to live together in peace. In our shrinking and globalized world, different cultural, religious, and ethnic communities will inevitably and increasingly be brought into greater proximity with one another. As communities feel themselves increasingly threatened by the emerging English-dominated global culture, it is likely that they will react by placing an even greater emphasis on their own cultural identities. The problem of inter-community coexistence is here to stay. To my mind, the international community will have to pay far greater attention to this question than has thus far been the case. What we're seeing at the moment is intervention, involvement on a crisis management basis here and there, while the international community looks away from so many other similar conflicts. There is a great need in this regard for more intense international debate, for focused planning, for an approach not to, in a haphazard way, on an ad hoc basis, address the symptoms, but really to go to the root cause of ongoing conflict almost in every region of the world at a rate which we dare not ignore. For some, it's turned to solutions. The immediate solution to intercommunal conflict is partition, particularly where communities constitute clear majorities in definable geographic areas. This was accepted as the solution in the case of Slovakia and the Czech Republic, and was the basis for the fragmentation of the Soviet Union and the old Yugoslavia. This is now accepted as the right direction for the resolution of the problem in Israel and Palestine. But obviously, it would not be practical or desirable in other cases. What would, for instance, be the position if the Inuit, the native inhabitants of much of the north of Canada, wish to establish their own state? Or the Navajo were to decide to do so in their homeland in the southwestern United States? Clearly, we would open the door to chaos if every such community decided to opt for partition. And one of the countless minorities throughout the world that do not constitute majorities in any part of the countries in which they reside. There is, for them, no question of partition or secession. In South Africa, from 1960 onwards, we tried to achieve a solution to our complex problems on the basis of ethnic partitioning. We failed. We failed because economic and demographic forces had already integrated the country to such an extent that separation was impossible. We failed because a majority of black South Africans said, this is not how we want our political rights. We failed because hand in hand with that went morally indefensible other measures of discrimination. We have learned that the challenge in our circumstances was not and is not how different communities should best go their separate ways, but rather how they can best learn to coexist in a spirit of harmony and mutual respect. And it will be the same in other places. Even if the Palestinians and the Israelis, the Greeks and the Turkish Cypriots, the Protestants and the Catholics in Northern Ireland succeed in concluding formal agreements, they will still have to learn how to coexist peacefully, because they will still be together in the same area. They will still be active within the same broad economy, etc., etc. The challenge is to devise approaches and to establish norms that will enable different cultural and ethnic communities to live peacefully with one another. To achieve this, I believe we must reach broad agreement on the cultural, linguistic, and educational rights that such communities should enjoy. We should also establish globally acceptable norms for the manner in which important cultural minorities should be represented in the processes by which they are governed, and the mechanisms that should be created to ensure cordial relations between communities. Of course, there are a number of international and regional conventions that deal with these questions. Most notably, the Declaration on the Rights of Persons Belonging to National or Ethnic or Religious Minorities of 1993, the Draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples of 1994, and the European Union's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities of 1995. Although they are often ambiguous on key questions, we can draw some important broad conclusions from them. Let me identify a few. In most cases, secession is not an option because it poses an unacceptable threat to the territorial integrity of existing states. The forced assimilation of the melting pot is also unacceptable because of the resistance and conflict that it is likely to cause. There is a generally accepted norm that states should not discriminate against their citizens because of their ethnic, cultural, or religious affiliations. It is also generally accepted that minorities have a right to use their languages and promote their cultures and traditions. Generally, indigenous peoples are regarded as having more extensive communal rights than other minorities. All that can be extracted from these international and regional conventions. However, there is less unanimity regarding the right of cultural minorities to mother tongue education and the responsibility of states to provide such education. To the right, there is less unanimity about the right of communities to a meaningful voice in decisions affecting their own communities, and as to the degree to which provision should be made for the special accommodation of minorities in broader national decision-making processes and in the national identity. South Africa has a great deal of experience dealing with intractable ethnic disputes. Until 10 years ago, as you all know, we were involved in a seemingly hopeless downward spiral of conflict and repression. Yet, to the surprise of the world, and sometimes to our own surprise, we managed to pull back from the abyss and resolve our long-standing differences through peaceful negotiations. We succeeded in negotiating a new constitution that addressed most of the reasonable concerns of all our major parties and major groupings. We emerged with one of the most liberal constitutions in the world that now provides a solid foundation for our young multicultural democracy. It makes some provision for the multicultural nature of our society by giving recognition to all 11 of our national languages and by undertaking to provide education in these languages wherever it is practical. However, formal agreements are not enough. There are signs 6.5 years after the creation and the birth of the new South Africa that relations between our communities are beginning to show strain. How then should we and the world better address the challenge presented by multicultural societies? How can we establish and maintain democratic systems where, on the one hand, as it should be, the will of the majority prevails, while on the other hand, as it should also be, but without alienating minorities and consigning them to permanent political impotence? I believe that the answer to these questions lies in maybe adopting the following broad approach. Firstly, in multicultural societies, communities should be given maximum breathing space to promote their identities and to cherish their traditions. The root of prejudice and inter-communal conflict is fear, the perception that the intimate interests of the community are under threat. The foundation for intercommunal peace is accordingly community security and the assurance that the traditions and the basic language and cultural rights of communities will be respected. Secondly, all communities should be regarded as equal. Minority communities should not be relegated to some kind of second-class status. Their identity should be accepted as essential parts, essential building blocks of the national identity. They should be entitled to the same rights as all other communities, regardless of their ethnic, religious, cultural, or class origins. There is a very dangerous view that economically advantaged communities should not qualify for the same protection as others. In fact, such communities are often at the greatest risk. One has but to think of the Indians in Uganda during the 60s, the Chinese in some Southeast Asian countries more recently, whites in Zimbabwe today, and of course the Jews throughout the centuries in Europe, culminating in the horror of the Holocaust. Thirdly, multicultural society should, wherever possible, strive for inclusivity. Simple majoritarianism where significant minorities can be excluded from all the processes of executive government, I believe should be avoided. All communities should feel that they are adequately represented in all of the institutions by which they are governed. Special care should be taken that no community feels isolated or alienated from the governmental process. Fourthly, cultural and religious communities should play a major role in all decisions that affect their interests. Multicultural society should grant minorities an important role in managing the affairs of their respective communities. There should be mechanisms which enable it. In South Africa, we have agreed to the establishment, although at the moment we're treading a bit of water on it, we're not making headway, to the establishment of cultural councils, which would have to be specifically consulted in the event of legislation which might have a specific impact on their cultural rights and interests. Fifthly, a culture of toleration and pride in diversity should be cultivated. Diversity isn't wrong. Archbishop Tutu called the South African nation with its 11 languages the Rainbow Nation. Mutual respect and pride in the diversity of national cultures, I believe, should be fostered through the educational system, through the teaching of national languages, and through the media. We shouldn't try to force everybody into the same pigeonhole. We must accommodate all the alliances and all the concentric circles which is alive within a nation, within a country, and within a region. In the sixth instance, negative discrimination, of course, of any form, should be strictly prohibited. No community should feel victimized or excluded from any aspect of national life because of its cultural or ethnic identity. And the same goes for issues like the rights of women, non-discrimination against women. Somehow or another in South Africa, we're struggling with this. This is the cornerstone of our new Bill of Rights. There shall not be discrimination on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, gender, and a whole list of other things in respect of which one finds discrimination quite often. But there is also a need for reparation. There's also a need to do something about the injustices of the past. And therefore we've written into this Bill of Rights, yes, there shall be no discrimination, but there shall, for some time, be affirmative action. How to balance the two. How not to fall into the trap of using affirmative action in circumstances like we have to actually establish a new institutionalized form of racial discrimination is a big challenge, and we are struggling with this. You in America also have, with different circumstances, a lot of experience in this regard. In the last instance, I believe there should, at the same time, while recognizing that diversity is a reality and it should be tolerated and there should be pride also in the diversity, at the same time there should be a concerted effort to establish also in countries an inclusive overarching national identity around common values, around common national symbols and common goals. One can build a framework of a new national identity, uniting all the building blocks in this diverse society behind those common goals, making them feel proud about those common symbols, about the anthem, about the flag, making them take hands because of a common destiny. But the only way to really achieve that is to also say, we do that out of our free will from the basis of the reality of our diversity. We don't try to stamp out the one reality in order to strengthen the need for a second reality. We must strike that very same balance between non-discrimination and affirmative action. Likewise, between diversity and unity. I believe that if multicultural communities observe these principles, they can live together in harmony. In South Africa, we have made significant progress, despite the strains to which I referred. The reality is that relations between communities, like all human relations, require constant attention, nurturing, and communication. The international community, ladies and gentlemen, can do a great deal more to address what has become the greatest single threat to peace. In particular, it needs to do much more to define and protect the rights of cultural, ethnic, and religious minorities by implementing, strengthening, and expanding existing international agreements and conventions. It needs to establish an international norm for these rights, just as it has done so successfully for the rights of individuals, of women and children. And it needs to measure the behavior of governments against this norm. If it does so, I'm confident that it will soon discover that the societies that are the worst afflicted by intercommunal violence are also those that have the least respect for the rights of their constituent communities. We have entered the global village. It is exciting, it is very often confusing, and sometimes a little frightening. Increasingly, people from different cultural backgrounds will be rubbing shoulders in the streets and marketplaces of the global village. The presence of people from so many different cultures is one of the most enriching aspects of our new world. But it will also require us to observe new codes of behavior and to acknowledge the multidimensional rights of people as citizens, as members of organizations, as distinct communities, as individual men and women. Let us tackle the problem of world peace by going to the root cause for the lack of world peace. It is this. It is, in many instances, the tyranny of a majority. It is the alienation of important minorities. It is the suppression of either a specific religion or a specific language or a specific culture or a specific group. I hope that from the studies in this Institute of Excellence will also emanate answers, will also come direction-giving doctorates and master's theses which can enrich this debate. Because somehow or another, if we don't do it, world peace will remain a dream, pie in the sky, unachievable. We need to come to grips with the management and accommodation of diversity in a just and equitable way. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much, President deKlerk, for those extremely timely comments, and I think it is a source of great wonder and delight to all of us that we can actually look to the experience of South Africa to be an inspiration and a place where lessons may be exchanged and learned. One of the great delights, of course, of programs here at the ARCO Forum is the opportunity they provide for members of the audience to participate in a discussion with the speaker. President deKlerk is a seasoned professional at dealing with questions, so I'm not going to get in the way, but perhaps those who are near the microphones upstairs might just wave so that he will know where to look in giving all people an opportunity to ask questions. Okay, can you see them?
And then to here.
Right, and I could just remind you to please identify yourselves, keep your questions short, and they should be questions. Thank you, President deKlerk.
Thank you. Shall we do it clockwise, ladies and gentlemen, and start here, and go there, and then come down here, and do it in rotation. Right. The lady to my left.
My name is Katie Klingen-Smith, and I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School in the master's program. My question is, I think that your choice of subjects this evening is very interesting as a white South African, and I understand that there is a lot of immigration from South Africa, from South Africa, both of Afrikaners and of English South Africans. And I'm curious if you could speak a bit of why you think this is happening and what you think this means in the future for South Africa as part of the vision that you have described tonight.
Thank you. I think if we were to drift in South Africa into a permanent situation, because at the moment there's no doubt that white South Africans feel somewhat sidelined, feel somewhat marginalized. It is leading to unacceptably high immigration of highly skilled people. In Canada, I'm told you, in some parts of Canada, you have a 50% chance of being treated by a South African trained doctor or dentist if you need their services. The same applies in Perth. There are great South African communities growing in Los Angeles and elsewhere in the United States. I think South Africa and Southern Africa needs those talents. And somehow or another, although we have this, the imbalance which is perceived to exist at the moment with regard to affirmative action, which is perceived to have become almost a reverse form of apartheid, this time anti-white apartheid, has led to some apathy. I have made it one of the main goals of my foundation to fight this apathy. Not to fight anybody, the government, I'm out of politics, but to fight this apathy and to convince people, and they're not just white, to come onto the playing field and say, I can make a difference. In my private life, in my work situation, in the church to which I belong, through the NGO which I support, I can make a difference. Come onto the playing field. Don't sit on the sidelines. Don't hide in a corner. Don't run away. I'm not saying that every South African which is leaving South Africa is running away. I understand the reasons, and it's wonderful for us to have open international borders, to be welcomed again in universities like these, no longer to be isolated, and we must use all those opportunities and develop our talent from all our people in South Africa to the highest and make use of the international opportunities. But somehow, within South Africa, we need to make this important minority feel wanted and to convince them that they don't run the risk at the end of the day after 10 or 20 years to end up where the whites in Zimbabwe find themselves at the moment. Right. The lady up there.
Hello, my name is Tenjin Kosi. I'm a first year here at Harvard College. My father was a political exile from South Africa during the 1960s, and I've been living in South Africa for the past 8 years. My question is this. It is recognized that you were involved in the transition that led to South Africa's move to democracy and the dismantling of apartheid. Yet if you always had these goals in mind, how can you justify the policies you upheld as Minister of Education, which saw the separate and lower level of education of blacks during the 1980s in South Africa.
Now, thank you for being brief in your question. Being brief means that you didn't say what you believe were the views I held about education. Because you apparently believe that they were negative, that they were racialistic, etc. So let me say what I did when I was Minister of Education. I didn't control one school. I was the Minister of National Education. And there were about 12 or 15 education departments operative throughout South Africa. It was my task to coordinate this. And one of the central tasks was to reduce the amount spent on education in white schools and to shift that money to black education and some of the other education departments in order to upgrade the quality of education and to work towards a central norm where there would be, in terms of the same formula, equal spending irrespective of race or ethnicity or gender or language throughout the total education system in South Africa. So I was deeply involved in an active reform program working towards a more just system and a more just application of the 20% of the total budget which we spent also at that time on education in South Africa. It's amongst the highest in the world. But what I do believe about education has nothing to do with race, and you would have heard it in my speech. I believe that you are not doing a child a favor if you don't teach a child difficult subjects in the language he and his teacher best understands. If we analyze the education results also now, 7 years after the 1994 election, why do we find that the passing rate amongst black pupils is in the vicinity of 50% and amongst white and colored and Indian pupils in the vicinity of 90%? Not because blacks are not as clever, but because for a great percentage of them, they are taught in a language which they don't fully understand, and quite often by teachers who can't very well speak that language. And to be taught mathematics and natural science and all these difficult subjects while you are struggling with the stumbling block of not having fully mastered the language in which you have to write your exams, in which things are explained to you, is uneducational. It militates against a fundamental principle of education. So when I say that the linguistic factor should be accommodated in education, I say it from, I'm not an educationist, I'm a lawyer, but I'm saying it from the viewpoint of well-proven educational research and educational principles which apply. I was a reformer also as Minister of Education, but I believed that the diversity should be of South Africa with its 11 languages should be accommodated in the education system for the educational reasons that I've now given. The lady there.
Yes, hello, Mr. deKlerk. My name is
Hello.
Bernadette Atwaine, and I particularly admire your role in unification of South Africa. My question is somewhat similar. As Minister of Education, although I do acknowledge your role in increasing funding and the reform role that you did play, you were in favor of a separate but equal, what Americans would call a separate but equal doctrine in terms of blacks and whites going to separate schools. The ideals you've expounded here today have been of unification and equality, things that we all respect. My question is, why didn't you begin this kind of vociferous advocate, being an advocate of these ideas earlier in your political career, as when when you were Minister of Education? That'd just be one example, but earlier in your political career, what were the barriers to you as an individual, as a person, coming out and saying this is wrong, segregation is wrong, separate but equal does not work?
Let me start by, I will be a bit long with this reply because I think it touches on what everybody would like to hear from me a bit. Let me start by saying, what did I support when I was a young law student? And when I was a young lawyer, and even when I entered Parliament as a young backbencher? I supported a vision which I idealistically believe could bring justice to all the people in South Africa. I supported a vision of building a little Europe there, of building so many nation states, a southern Africa where the Zulus would have their own country, Zululand, like the French have France, and where the Sothos would have their own like the Germans have Germany, and where the Vendas would have one like the Dutch have Holland, and where so on, the Tswanas, the Northern Sothos, the 9 different nations which exist. You know, these 9 indigenous languages don't fall out of the air. The Bible has been written in each one of them, translated. Some of them are as different from each other as German is from French. Some of them are related, like the Germanic languages are related and the Romanic languages are related. But somehow or another, that is what I support. And then we believe that in order to build this and in order to structure this, you have to give self-determination on the basis of your cultural and ethnic affiliation. And therefore we built 10 parliaments. And there were 10 cabinets and 10 first ministers of the various black nations. And they had elections. It's not as if there were no democratic rights. And we shared this ideal and striven for this ideal that somehow or another that way we can build something then, an umbrella over this like the European Union, because of our economic common interests and other common interests on a confederal basis. And then slowly but surely, this failed to realize, notwithstanding best efforts, notwithstanding billions of rand being spent in the development of the homelands. It failed because only 4 opted for independence. And the rest of the world didn't even recognize those who opted for independence. The other 6 said, yes, we'll take the powers, we'll run our own education, but we want also to sit in the parliament in Cape Town. The majority of blacks rejected it. So we came to, slowly, to the conclusion, as happens in the private lives of all of us. You don't change overnight. You go through a process. And we went through a process which, since the early 80s, became an organized, focused process of really looking at ourselves, asking, where do we stand? And we, in the end, were honest with ourselves and said, we have to admit that this dream, this vision, has failed. And to continue with something which you know won't work can't be morally justified. We have to change fundamentally. But how do we change? We want to get off the tiger, but we don't want to be devoured by the tiger when we get off. Somehow or another, we must bring about the change in a way which will not result in chaos, which will not result in bloodbaths, as has happened in many other parts of Africa. It must be organized. It must be structured. It must be done in a way which is constitutional, where there is never a crisis of authority. And it must be done through negotiation. We cannot work out a plan and say again, yeah, this will be good for you, take it. Then even if it's the best plan, it will be rejected. So the solution had to come on the basis of getting all the major role players to agree that this is the solution. So that all the major leaders in South Africa would go back to their people, their power bases, their parties, and say, look, we've made concessions, but this is the solution. It needed time. There was no way in which the situation could be changed overnight. You ask, why didn't I start sooner? I think, and I admit that in my autobiography, if I look back, we took too long. At times, the pressure which was put on us actually delayed change. The sanctions at times delayed change. In 1977, John Foster won the biggest election ever, biggest victory, on the basis of an anti-American platform to whip up the emotion of the voters, to say, who's the United States to tell us what to do? And he made them angry, and they got into the swing of things. And they went and dutifully voted. Not so much for, but for non-intervention in our internal affairs. And that delayed change. Constructive engagement, which was the policy of Reagan, was a much more focused and a much more hopeful strategy vis-à-vis international influence. So yes, I think it took too long. But one thing we must please demolish in our minds is this image that South Africa have been the inventors of apartheid. Apartheid has existed throughout the world. It has existed here in the States. It was practiced in the colonies of all the colonial powers. Africa was raped by the colonial powers. In many instances, when the colonial powers left, they left chaos behind them. Nothing much has been built up. They were just taking what they could take and making money out of it. In South Africa's case, it was different. In South Africa's case, we fought the first anti-colonial freedom war against Great Britain exactly 100 years ago in modern history. So, in South Africa's case, there was always the wish, but within the framework of the thinking of the time, the wish to be fair, to bring justice. And therefore, I reject what one often hears, the comparison between what has happened in South Africa, for instance, and Nazism. We've never had genocide in South Africa. We have a prouder track record vis-à-vis indigenous people, and I say it without aggression, than the United States or Australia. We have not invented racial discrimination and racism. And what I'm proud of is, even though it took too long, and I apologized for that. It's not as if I didn't stand up and on behalf of me, my predecessors, my people, the party which has governed South Africa for most of the past century, apologized for the pain and the suffering and the indignity that those policies had brought. But I didn't only apologize. We repealed each and every discriminatory law in South Africa before the '94 election. When President Mandela took reins of power, he received a clean slate. And this is how we should look at the future. If we get caught up in the past, and if we continue to spend too much energy on arguing about the past, we will not see and use the windows of opportunity of the present. I'm not asking anybody to forget the past. But if you forever keep a section of the community in the dock as the accused, making them feel like second-class citizens, which is a risk which we are running at the moment, you sow the seeds of new confrontation, of new tension, of new problems. South Africa needs all its people and all its talents. And we need to close, to a certain extent, the book on the past, without forgetting, but without, on the other hand, allowing the past to drag us down and to hold us back from doing what we need to do. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. deKlerk. My name is Phumla Gobodo Madikizela. I'm a South African, and thanks to you.
A well-known surname in South Africa.
Thanks to you and that vote in '94, I cast my first vote in my adulthood. I would like to comment you on something concerning Eugene deKlerk. Eugene deKlerk is a question. He is serving 212 years and 2 life sentences for the crimes he committed as apartheid government's head of covert operations. One of the things he said recently is that he is very bitter and quotes, "at all those who gave me orders, yet the person who sticks most of all in my throat is former President F.W. deKlerk." I'd like to ask if it is your view that a man who served the apartheid government, funded by secret funds by the state, rewarded with medals by the state, I'd like to know if you think, in your view, that it is unreasonable for this man to put the blame for the crimes he committed on the shoulders of heads of states, of previous heads of states. And also, if you think that there's a way in which heads of states could be made accountable for the crimes committed by foot soldiers under their government, how could this be handled? Milosevic today is denying his role in what happened in his country. How can you bring the balance between leadership, state leaders, and those who commit atrocities under their orders? And I'd like you to answer the question specifically in relation to Eugene deKlerk as the head of apartheid's covert operations. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that question. Let me start firstly by the last part of your question. And that is, can heads of government be held accountable for everything which is done by their foot soldiers? No. Heads of government and ministers in cabinets and managers in banks and businesses and principals of universities, the managers of all organizations, which include the heads of government, should be tested against the fact, what is their policy? Secondly, have they put reasonable measures in place to ensure that the policy is adhered to? And have they put reasonable measures and mechanisms in place to prevent the breaking of those rules? And are they paying enough attention to ensure discipline and order, and that their true orders are executed correctly? And if they've done all those things, then it would be unfair to fire a bank manager because a teller in one of the branches nonetheless steals a client's money. And it would be unfair to fire a minister of religion because of something one of the members of his congregation does. And to fire a principal of a university, or to say to a head of government or a minister in a cabinet, look what somebody has done who has been under your control. If the measures are strict, if the policy is clear and transparent and acceptable, and if there are mechanisms in place to, within reason, ensure the adherence to prescriptive rules and regulations, then it would be unfair. That should be the test, to my mind. In any government, in President Clinton's government, in all his predecessors in the past 20 years, and it will happen under President Bush, and I'm sure it happens in Canada and it happens across the world, there are those who break the rules. When you are almost in a state of war, when you are involved in a serious conflict, this risk becomes greater. Because if you're involved in a fight where there are underground activities, where there is a gray world in which no rules are observed in any event, when there's a threat of public disruption, when there's a policy on the other side of planting bombs in sports stadiums, when there is infiltration and when there is really a state of revolutionary conflict, then, and I say that, and I don't deny that I was involved in saying, then surely you rewrite the rules. You, for instance, call a state of emergency, which militates against one's feeling for justice to put somebody behind bars without trial. It infringes basic human rights. But in order to curb the violence, in order to prevent revolution, in order to save lives, under such circumstances, governments are forced to have such measures and to institute such measures. But it was never the policy. And I was never part of any policy decision, and I was never present at any discussion where any indication was given that it would be okay to commit cold-blooded murder, that assassination was acceptable. And no policy of which I was part could reasonably be interpreted as a green light by people like deKlerk to do what they did, to commit those atrocities. I want to share two other facts with you. Firstly, I didn't want people like deKlerk to qualify for amnesty. From all sides, I wanted us to do in South Africa what was done in Namibia under our leadership, in conjunction with the United Nations, in conjunction with the United States, where we followed the Norgard rules to say, yes, everybody who committed crimes with political motives would qualify for amnesty, except those who were involved in very violent crimes, except those who were involved in premeditated murder and crimes like that. It was the ANC which put the pressure in September 1992 when we restarted the negotiations to say one of their preconditions was for negotiations to go ahead that there must be a blanket amnesty for whatever crime was committed. Whether it was a bomb which was thrown into a bar, into a trattoria or what, everybody must qualify. And in the end, it was one of the most painful concessions I made. If I had what I wanted, I would have liked the likes of Eugene deKlerk never to qualify for amnesty. Secondly, let me say in her absence, secondly, Eugene deKlerk was totally against what I did, and the likes of him. They didn't want the 94 election to take place as it took place. They didn't want a one-person, one-vote system. They have accused me of being a sellout. And therefore, on this issue, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission could not make a single finding, notwithstanding their very best efforts of me being involved in the authorization or in the indirect authorization of acts of atrocity like the ones she referred to. It is the one thing. I'm a man full of sins. It's the one thing where between me and my God, I have a clear conscience.
Okay, I'm a student at School of Public Health. A major challenge to all ethnic groups in sub-Saharan Africa is the AIDS crisis. And I'd like to know your assessment of the situation in South Africa and what kinds of assistance that you think your country needs to deal from the international community to deal with the situation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for raising that. I would urge all of you to buy the latest edition of Time. They devote, I think, about 20 pages to the AIDS situation worldwide, but they focus specifically on Africa and on Southern Africa. And as they say there, anybody who has looked at the pictures that they publish and who reads what they've written there can't go away and be unaffected. It's the greatest pandemic which the world has ever seen. We're talking about 17 million people in Africa already who have died. About another projected 30 million who will die, I think, in the next 10 years. We're talking about 20% of all women in South Africa having been infected by the HIV virus. And the figure for our neighboring countries is 25%, 21%, 22%. We're talking about an overall infection rate in the lower part of sub-Saharan Africa at the moment of around about 20%, between 20 and 25%. And the orphans which are left. It is a great tragedy. And not enough is being done about this. In most of those countries, internationally, jointly and severally. And I go from platform to platform making a plea for much greater involvement. We need help. We need medical supplies at acceptable prices. We need research to be trebled and quadrupled. We need compassion. We need treatment. We need help. Many mistakes have been made. But there are examples of how it can be turned around. And in this regard, I lift my hat to President Museveni of Uganda. There it was, at a certain stage, the worst than in all countries across Africa. And they've turned it around there. And they've improved the situation, and there the trend is absolutely a downward trend. So thank you for raising it. It's a big issue. We really need the world to put their heads together and to find ways and means. I also saw a program, although percentage-wise it is small in the United States, it is not negligible. And here also, research shows that it's growing. So it's a worldwide problem. It is at the moment heavily concentrated on Africa, but diseases like that don't honor borders. They have a way of expanding and going over borders. It's a world threat, and it's something which the world needs to open their hearts and minds to. Thank you very much. I'm told this has to be the last question. We're 10 minutes over time. I'm sorry that I can't entertain the questions of all the others. You can invite me back a second time and we'll just have a question and answer session.
Thank you all for being here. Thank you for your very excellent questions, for your attention. And this concludes the meeting, and I'd like to ask you to join me again in thanking President deKlerk for his presentation and his openness today.
That way. Elita, join us.